Good morning or good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today to this ESIL event. My name is Stefania Di Stefano, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and I'm also a coordinator of the ESIL Interest Group on International Law and Technology. So thanks again for joining us for this event. Today, our interest group and Cambridge University Press are celebrating the publication of the book Drone Programs in International Law at Techno-Legal Machinery by Rebecca Mignot-Mahdavi. Let me share the slide here with the title so you can all see the book cover. So rather than a book, Rebecca is currently a lecturer at the University of Manchester, and she will start as an assistant professor in international law and technology at Sciences Po Law School in September. And today, so we're celebrating the launch of her book, and instead of presenting the book itself, we have conceptualized an event as a conversation between the book and other scholarly endeavors on how international law, technology, and war, but also societies more broadly, interact with one another and reshape one another. And to this end, we have an amazing lineup of speakers, and I'm going to briefly introduce them here, and then we will start with a short discussion. I will give the floor to each of the panelists, and then at the end, we will open for a Q&A. So our speakers today are Professor Gina Heathcote, who is a professor of gender studies and international law at SOAS Law School, Gender and Media, and she writes in feminist methodologies, security, and international law. Her most recent publications include an article entitled Abandoning the Idealized White Subject of Legal Feminism, a manifesto for silence in a Lusophone register. And then another article, a chapter titled Jane Haddam's Positive Piece from the Everyday to the International, published in Imi Talgren's recent edited book entitled Portraits of Women in International Law, New Names and Forgotten Faces. Professor Heathcote is also the author of the monograph Feminist Dialogues on International Law, Successes, Tensions and Futures, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2019, and also the monograph The Law and the Use of Force, a feminist analysis, published with Routledge in 2012. And she has also co-authored with Emily Jones and Sarah Bertotti, The Law of War and Peace, a Gender Analysis, Volume 1 in 2021. Her current research is focusing on maritime technology and security. Then we have Khalil Dewan, who is a PhD researcher at law at SOAS University of London, where he's investigating the British drone program. He's a member and fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies at the University of London, Society of Advanced Legal Studies. He's also working as the head of legal investigation at Stoke White Law Firm, which is based in London. And in this function, he has conducted investigative fieldwork in the US, UK, and France drone warfare in Yemen, Syria, Somalia, and Mali. He has interviewed US Air Force drone operators, as well as the British Royal Air Force drone operators. And he was requested to submit expert evidence to the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drones and Modern Conflict. His work has been cited by the US Army War College Quarterly and the Oxford Research Group. Khalil's work has been covered in international media, including Reuters, Associated Press, and The Guardian, and the Washington Post and other media commentary on BBC News, Al Jazeera, and TRT World. Khalil holds an LLB and an LLM in international law from SOAS, University of London. And last but not least, we have Klaudia Klonowska, who is also a PhD candidate in international law at the Asser Institute and University of Amsterdam since 2021. She studies the interactions of humans and AI-enabled decision support systems in the military decision-making process and the consequences thereof of the exercise of human judgment under international humanitarian law and human rights law. She's generally interested in looking at social techno-legal assemblages, and she's a member of the NWO-funded research project called Designing International Law and Ethics into Military Artificial Intelligence. Klaudia has published an excellent article with the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law on Article 36 review of AI decision support systems and other emerging technologies and warfare. Klaudia, Gina, and Khalil are all welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I will give the floor now to Rebecca for some introductory remarks, and then we will give you the floor to discuss and engage with the book. Thank you again. And Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stefania. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this event, but mostly I want to thank Gina, Khalil, and Klaudia for agreeing, first of all, to read the book and engage with it. I could not have hoped for a nicer way to celebrate the book than to enter in conversation with you three, and I'm really, really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. A quick introduction of the book, and to put it also in a broader context, and start a conversation with you all who have joined. It has been many years now that in my research I'm driven by the question of how law and technology interact with and reshape one another, and what effects it has on bodies, behaviors, societies. So how techno-legal machineries manufacture experiences is something that I'm quite interested in. This monograph focuses on drone programs as, more than anything, a case study for how the interaction between international law, technology, and security, in this case, military strategy, created the possibility for infinite warfare and for expanding state power over populations living under drones, to the point of altering the rituals, traditions, ways of life of people living under drones. So it's a bit of an archive of the present, where I piece together the factual, technical, bureaucratic traces of this machinery, where the law and technology together act as these indispensable factors, or actants, if you wish, of this stable mode of anywhere and everywhere war. Of course, the time frame of academic publishing is quite long, so it connects well with research projects that I have conducted over the past 3 years since the completion of this project. Since the completion of this project, I have navigated different sites of techno-legal governance beyond the battlefield, with a view to accumulating traces of other techno-legal modes of governance, and to grounding reflections of how law and technology together manufacture experiences, bodies, and behaviors. And because it has been a long time that I've completed this project, it was for me very important also to have this book launch as a conversation, including around this notion of techno-legal framework, which is at the core of my current project as well, to insist on the co-constitutiveness of technology and the law, and to keep on discussing how they're not separate objects, but how together, beyond human, non-human dichotomies, perform as actors of the same techniques and procedures of governance. And I will leave it to this and just spoil myself with the conversation that Gina, Khalil, and Klaudia are going to create. So thanks so much again to all of you. And I guess, Gina, I can give you the floor directly. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you to the interest group for the invitation to join you all here today. I'm actually in Melbourne, so it's in the evening, so apologies if I'm sort of away from my desk, but really thrilled to be able to join you all despite the distance. So thank you to the interest group on international law and technology for hosting, Rebecca for her very generous invitation to look at her work. I think actually it was an invitation. I was like, please, can I read your book? Get me a copy after conversations that we'd have. And to Stefania for chairing today. But it's a real pleasure to speak alongside you and with you today. Part of having the opportunity to speak today, I think, stems to a prior conversation that Rebecca and I were having about the use of force in particular, and laws of war as a space of closure, often for new voices. And I just wanted to kind of start with just making note is in a field that's often dominated by very traditional and doctrinal approaches, which is not to say fantastic doctrinal work in it. It is a remarkable first book, and I don't say that lightly. It's doctrinally detailed. It draws in and discusses both the use in bello and the use ad bellum with both flair and precision. It has a rare capacity, though, to enrich both doctrine and critical legal engagement through a wide-ranging engagement with legal theory, political theory, and critical legal accounts, as well as the doctrine, drawing in particular on the work of Foucault, but not only Foucault's work, to frame the argument. In addition to this, and this is why I think it is a remarkable book, and I think something that was really needed in the field with respect to legal studies of drones, there's a very careful account of state practice and opinion juris in chapter 2, looking at French, UK, and US activities and use, both in terms of their practice, as difficult as they can be ascertained in this area, but also their legal justifications. And as we see expansion of drone warfare and the types of technologies that we're seeing entering the battlefield, I can't think of a more timely and important book. The central claims of the book are the ones that and the ones that I want to speak more directly to today, as follows. Maybe it's just me, but one of the things that I really, really like about this book, and maybe you're all already thinking this and you work closer to the field than me, but Rebecca insists in the book that we look at drone strikes and ask about the legality of drone strikes, but the legality of drone programs. And that resonates to the way engages with the larger consequences of drone programs as opposed to where I think the
Gina,
dominance in the field is looking at individual strikes.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we cannot hear you very well. So if you can, I don't know, perhaps either check your connection or maybe, repeat the last couple of sentences. That.
Yeah, sure. So I was just, is that better? If I come a bit closer to the, is that better? Okay,
yes,
sorry.
Yes,
it's probably just talking with my hands and getting too enthusiastic. So I wanted to draw attention to the focus of the book is not on drone strikes, but on drone programs. And I think this is quite important. So much of the legal literature fixates on individual strikes or groups of strikes or strikes in particular locations, but not the legal consequences of drone programs more broadly. And it's one of those claims in the book that as soon as you read it and acknowledge it, it's so obvious and it's so important that we expand the range of our scholarship to think about the consequences of drone programs rather than just strikes. And I really think it is something that is under-discussed in the literature, the legal literature in particular. I don't think in other sites of literature. The other element is the central claim of the book that drone programs function as a techno-legal machinery. And I think this refusal of Rebecca in the book to separate the techno-legal is a real strength and important. And the idea of machineries or the machinery that she's describing as performative, infiltrating, capturing, and conducting the conduct of human body institutions to shape social interactions. And this allows throughout the book Rebecca to move between both external and internal accounts of law, which again is another strength. And the argument then that Rebecca makes is that the consequence for international lawyers in particular and for law is that we see this shift to individualized warfare and a dematerialized and deterritorialized war. And before, I just want to pick up on a couple of points on that, on the idea of the individualized war and dematerialized war. I just want to add that for me, the insistence again that the people and populations living under drones as being part of the book and the understandings that we gain from people and populations living under drones again marks the book, at least within the literature, the legal literature, as distinctive in the field. It's so important and can't be overlooked, and yet so often not part of the legal analysis. But I want to go back to this idea of individualized warfare that Rebecca illuminates through the book, and the straddling of both the jus in bello and the jus ad bellum, throughout the book. And I guess maybe you were predicting this question, Rebecca, but I'd love the panel as a whole to have a conversation about this. And perhaps it's a kind of prompt for future research. The claims about the individualized nature of warfare, as carefully as they're made throughout the book, I was waiting for the moment when you talked about that it's not just any individualized, but there's a racialized, gendered frames here. There are frames of sexuality, frames of religion that are produced through individualized warfare that I wanted to do. I wanted to hear more about the techno-legal machinery and what work it does in producing certain individuals as targets, as dangerous, and what the kind of interplay between the identification of individuals, but also the production of somebody is harmful at the same moment. I think the book does that work, but it also doesn't explicitly engage with gender, race, sexuality, religion. It's there, and I wondered if that's follow-up work or how you think about that when you think about the claims around individualized warfare in particular. With respect to thinking about dematerialized and deterritorialized warfare, which is, I think, the other kind of key claim that comes from the identification of the techno-legal machinery. Like the claims around individualized warfare, I agree and found your analysis innovative and refreshing, this combination of both an external and internal doctrinal but practical, practice-orientated analysis, incredibly powerful and really rich in the way you draw it out across the book. But I wanted to ask about the consequences for statehood and sovereignty. You do make the claim that sovereignty is both enhanced and undermined by the deterritorialized and dematerialized war. So the kind of shifting geographies and temporalities of war that are produced through drone and I would say other technologies. And I think the book thinks about the enhanced power, particularly of the states that you focus on, the UK, the US and France. But I wanted to think with you a little bit more about what power is undermined and invite you to kind of speak to that. But I also wanted to think about how states in the global south, but not only in the global south, but weaker states or economically less powerful, or even militarily less powerful states might also be enhanced and empowered through the kind of mimicking that we see of these dialogues. So that I just wondered how far your critique of sovereignty and statehood extends beyond just the states that you're looking at, and how does that play out both in terms of creating spaces for repetitions in otherwise less powerful states, and what moments is sovereignty undermined. And finally, I wanted to invite Rebecca and the other panelists to speak further on the relationship between law and violence, which is so evident and well demonstrated throughout the text, but perhaps not directly addressed. And what does it mean for the legal scholar? Where are the apertures for change or transformation? Are there apertures for change, or do we kind of walk away despondent? How does technology also offer spaces for resistance, for doing differently? Or is that potential for resistance frustrated? I think in feminist scholarship, the phrase is often, between resistance and compliance. And how is that replete here? What does law and violence and law's relationships to violence reproduce again and again? What I'm not saying is that, can you please give us all the answers? I don't think the answers ever sit with one scholar, and in many, many ways, I think that the book that you've produced here provides lots of answers to questions that have been otherwise overlooked, particularly in the doctrinal spaces of the field, the jus in bello and the jus ad bellum. So to close, thank you so much for writing this book. The research is exemplary, the writing is accessible, the depth and the levels of questions that it provoked in me, and the kind of desire to do more research and to take this forward you know, are fantastic. And yeah, well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina.
Over to Khalil. I think, is it Khalil or Klaudia?
Yes, exactly. So now I give the floor to Khalil, and yes, the floor is yours for your comment.
Thank you very much, dear panel and everyone attending. It's a real pleasure to be here today to speak regarding Rebecca's contribution, a scholarly one. And I think it's really important to congratulate her, because in the last 20 years, the literature has come across a very much doctrinal take to the matter. And sometimes we can deal with this in a very abstract way, but actually Rebecca's scholarship towards the end of her book takes a lot of risk, which I'm sure many of her colleagues have spoken to her about, but it's very much well received within the targeted communities, particularly people on the ground that I've interviewed over the years. They would be very shocked to hear that somebody of this caliber has written a book that actually speaks to them for the first time. And you know, that's something which is really great to see, particularly for me as well. And it's definitely something I will be furthering in my own thesis. There's a few things that I have actually pointed, not necessarily as a point of critique, but a point of discussion to take forward, because I really do think this is a piece of work which will flourish in the next few years. First and foremost, I would like to say that the book is full of character in terms of the scholarship and the theorists that you draw on: Foucault, Latour. We also have indeterminacy, which I like to see, which is one of my favorite areas, particularly in lawfare, though not necessarily pronounced, but definitely within the context. I also have seen some usage of post-colonial critique more subtly towards the end of the book, which I think is very important. And in the last 5 or 6 years, scholarship have referred to, and lastly, the techno-legal assemblages of the role of the law, which Gina touched upon quite eloquently. I think you did an amazing job looking at the 3 drone programs, and perhaps we will see very similar vernacular and legal assemblages with other rising drone powers in the Middle East and so on and so forth. So yes, the first thing I would like to go into, and I'll do it thematically rather looking at each chapter, and I have actually written a in-depth review for a journal, which is to come out very soon. But the first of all is the individualization of warfare. And this is something very early on, since 2010, I was kind of seeing on the ground. But at the time, I wasn't really an academic, I was an investigator, and I was seeing these on a day-to-day basis and an everyday violence, which Gina was referring to. And I think that's interesting because it's not a novel argument. There have been scholars such as Samuel Isocroft and Richard Pouts, also Craig Jones, and now Rebecca is also interjecting in her thesis, which is now her book. And I also would be putting forward this argument, perhaps with a little bit of an alteration, where I believe that it's not necessarily always in a war context. Sometimes it's in a law enforcement context as well. And this is the issue really, because we have a situation where drones, which comes onto my next theme, which is the global battle space. Drones, when I first started researching drones, I used to think in a very doctrinal manner. So law schools will teach the law in a very binary way. This is law, that is war, and that is not war. This is a spillover, this is unwilling and willing doctrine, so on and so forth. And then when I started speaking to US drone pilots or former US drone pilots, individuals who were really responsible for creating the signal intelligence of around Afghanistan and beyond in the region, I realize, and this is where Rebecca brings in the techno-legal assemblages, which is so very important, that it doesn't really matter whether there is a war or whether there is outside of a war, because drone warfare, it's the cables involved, the satellites involved, the intelligence sharing. We must remember that the reason why we're here today speaking about drone warfare is because of its primary reason was to target individuals who were known as threats. These individuals were justified via use of force against non-state armed groups, and Rebecca does that quite well to go through the 3 programs. And then really the individualization of warfare It's really about targeting individuals via personality drone strikes. And then you have the signature drone strikes, which I'll come on to later if I have time, with regards to the first drone strike in Yemen, to the last drone strike by the US in Afghanistan, and how it's very much the same, even though there has been 20 years of technology development, still there was bot strikes taking place in Kabul, including AI in the last strike. So I think moving forward, I won't go into the imminent threats and the materialization. I really do believe Rebecca's analysis is really much on point here with regards to the scholarship. But I will move on and make one point, and that is when we talk about the individualization of warfare, it's important when we look at the counterterrorism context that we are also looking at how the matrix, as the US administration coined it, is interconnected with other counterterrorism measures, including countering violent extremism. And the reason for that is because individuals who do not pose a threat are being enlisted on kill lists and then targeted wherever they may be. And it's not necessarily a material threat that needs to arise, but it's a preemption. So really what we have is a pre-crime space where CVE is informing targeted killings of a targeted community. And when we fast forward, let's say from 2013 onwards, more precisely, the technological assemblages, which are mostly around global South countries, are effectively conducting a spy mission. And this is highly problematic. So when we go back to think in a very doctrinal way, and we think, okay, this is war, this is not war, this is you know, a spillover, and then you have government lawyers deploying lawfare to justify these things. And there's all of a sudden, there's a scramble of norm contestation with regards to when can you strike an individual, when can you not strike an individual. And this is the primary reason why Rebecca's book is brave, because she asks questions that in the last 20 years, willingly or unwillingly, many lawyers did not want to ask. For instance, the extraterritorial jurisdiction, control, public power, the rituals of sovereignty. These things are highly applicable, whether we look at international human rights law or even the law of war, or are we speaking about a new norm which is being created where we target individuals, and because of the power dynamics, the politics, the sociology and the social constructs of the global war on terror, we no longer question whether that was a lawful strike or not. And I think that's really, really important. And all of this is addressed by Rebecca. I would add that sometimes I think I would have liked to have seen Rebecca's reflexivity in the book as well, of how her thinking has also evolved over time when she first started off and to what she has produced, because I've spoken to her for a few years now. And this is also, I would like to add prominently that she is one of the very few scholars under international law who also has interviewed drone pilots. And I think that's amazing, because there's no doubt that she has spoken to individuals about this, because the level of knowledge on the technological side is vast, it's on point. I know perhaps she could have gone further. I certainly have been researching this behind the scenes with former drone pilots, so I understand quite in depth with regards to the technology. And I think this is the beginning of a new conversation, really. And I'll move on to the rituals of sovereignty, as I was mentioning. So the extraterritorial applicability of human rights treaties, but also control. Rebecca focuses cogently on the population. And there's a few things here. She opens the conversation up within the legal space. Human rights organizations and NGOs have spoken about this and in depth. And they have also done a lot of investigations on this, but they didn't necessarily bring in the legal argument. And what we have here is two frames. First, those who are living under the population, their behavior has indeed changed, right? And second, the individuals who are being targeted, i.e. on a kill list, preemptive or anticipatory threats, etc. I have spoken to several drone pilots. When they are trained to be pilots, they are given training, perception training, cultural training. Within these trainings, it's one of colonialism. It's very much a colonial design. And in practice, the way that translates into practice is even more interesting when we consider the control. Firstly, the US government's program calls a successful kill, whether it's lawful or not, bug splat. So they call it bug splat. And this vernacular gets even worse inside the structures of the drone program. We also have between the British and the French and also the US, a lot of reprimands going on behaviorally with regards to drone pilots. I've been told by drone pilots that they have been pressured for not executing strikes because they deem to be certain targets unlawful. And then something that Gina might appreciate, which is the gendered lens. And I think it's really an interesting lens, particularly in the drone program. Female drone pilots, female individuals have faced different type of harassment within the drone program, which is highly shocking, but in the same time, for me, after doing all this fieldwork, I'm really not surprised. And all of this translates into violence from the structure of the drone program, but also from the violence we see from the ground as well. So Rebecca's book speaks to both sides of the conflict, which I highly appreciate. And the last thing I would like to mention, which is from a socio-legal perspective, is that whether we look at the French, who claim everyone is a quote unquote jihadist, or whether we look at the US, who believes anyone who is a military-aged male is fair game, and very similar vernacular on the UK side as well, they have approached these targets and their practices in a very disproportional manner. And that also translates on the ground. So whilst we're discussing the legalities within the law, and we sometimes diverge into socio-dynamics, people on the ground are also speaking about this. So Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was also speaking about this in 2002, because they also have issues with regards to their own justifications in war. Similarly, with the armed groups that we're discussing, they also have their own framework of governance regarding these things. And that's where the whole legal argument becomes very dangerous, because on the one hand, we have the states pushing a global battlefield, and there's a lot of debate around this. So some may agree that, yes, we are in a global battlefield because we can't really see the enemy, and they can be anyone and everyone. And on the other side, there are people being more sensible. If we take this techno-legal thinking to space, where it actually is intrinsically involved with satellites, well, the satellites are not necessarily in war or outside war. So what we may have in the future is a very capable rising military power saying, well, you're striking me, so I'm going to strike your satellite in space, right? I don't think that would necessarily be a sensible take moving forward for humanity, to have that sort of arrangement. But then again, we already have this arrangement in the world. So I'm very skeptical of where this is going, particularly with the advent of AI and also the 40 years in the making behind the scenes technology involved in drone warfare, which involves satellites and cables, intelligence sharing, including kill list sharing. The thing that really was missing for me in the book was, and perhaps it was willingly or unwillingly left out, but it's definitely was hinted towards, was kill lists. And the reason why that's important is because all three of these drone programs, and perhaps others, due to the secrecy we do not know, they are all interconnected. And on the one hand, we had the UK, who didn't even admit that they had a target killing policy, But in the same time, for the last 20 years, they have been assisting the American drone pilots in 7 different countries. So I think we, moving forward, the discussion should also intertwine with regards to who is who in the drone debate, who are the players. Germany recently had their debate where I was also engaged in 2 years ago, and they really were conflicted with regards to their role, because they were discussing whether to arm their drones or not. And I remember on stage saying, well, the reality of the debate and what's missing is that Germany is a violent actor within the assemblages of drone program. They didn't quite understand that point because they wasn't thinking critically. But here we are discussing targeted killings in a broader sense. And sometimes we tend to leave out the sociological impact. And the last point I'd like to make, and I can go on for ages, I can see I need to wrap up, is on civilian casualties, which is a very important point. And whilst Rebecca cogently references NGO reports, she also claims that it's an incomplete assessment due to states defining targets in an over-inclusive manner. I agree this is the case. But from my perspective and my own research, I also believe, as I was mentioning, that the training that pilots receive is highly racialized and in a context of dehumanization. And lastly, the last strike that occurred in Kabul as the US and others were leaving was actually conducted by the US against US aid workers, who killed them as well as his family members and children and toddlers. I believe it was called the Ahmadi family. I like putting names to these cases, otherwise we also contribute to the dehumanization. And really and truly, I spoke to individuals about this strike because I was really interested. After 20 years of extrajudicial killings, how can the US government end up killing its own people? So I found that really interesting. And there were discussions about AI being involved in this strike. There was also, they ended up labeling the strike as a righteous strike. But within a few hours, when they realized that actually civilians were killed, including their own personnel, they called it the great mistake. I know I can go on forever, but I would just like to leave it here and just congratulate Rebecca for her contribution, which I will definitely be carrying over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Khalil, for your contribution. And now I'd like to give the floor to Klaudia. Also, you mentioned you wanted to share a PowerPoint, so feel free to share it whenever it suits your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefania, and Gina, Khalil, thank you so much for this conversation together. And most of all, thank you, Rebecca, for sharing this wonderful work with us. I'm so happy for you that it's finally out there and that more people will be able to learn from your work, because I've had the pleasure to be earlier drafts of the book, and also to see as you evolve in this road from the PhD thesis to a book. And I have learned so much from you, so I'm very happy to see that outline for many more to learn. And what I wanted to touch upon in my shortened version, and I hope that you can hear me well because I do have connection issues, is one to very inspiring.
I'm sorry, Klaudia, I think we are losing you.
Is there, are you not hearing me well?
Yeah, now you're back. Thank you.
Oh no, I hope that that you'll be able to follow at least part of this. Yeah, so I was just saying that my intervention is will be about the methodological parts of the book that I found most inspirational, and then I'll tie it a little bit to the debates in algorithmic warfare that I'm a little bit more familiar with, but I think that this book contributes to it way more than those studying algorithms will acknowledge. So first, starting with the book, and this is where I wanted to show this is not a PowerPoint, point, but my little drone. And of course, at the risk that, well, a risk, it's of course a simplification of the nuanced argument of the book. But at the same time, it's a strategic move to show a visualization of that hopefully will also capture the memories. Can you see my image or not yet? Not yet. Okay, let's see. Oh, wait, I think you were nodding, but maybe it just took a moment for it to upload. How about now? Yeah, okay, I see it nodding. Okay, so yeah, this is something that accompanied me as I was reading the book. And again, Rebecca, apologies for all the simplifications here, but hopefully for those that haven't read the book, they will be able to capture a little bit the road that this book takes us on. And I wanted to mention this. I hope that you stay on the image as I still go between my notes. That I think that what is really important in the book is to what extent this analysis of the different agents is taken seriously, and how a lot of times in this literature on socio-technical approaches, there is a lack of really looking at maybe actors' language, or also here in this book really prominently loved how Rebecca in one of her sentences also said, in other words, the task is not to teach the actors what they are, but to reflect and to make sense of their coordinated actions have produced as an external observer. And that that understanding that it's something that in a coordinated way emerges, I see it as a deep and very nuanced exploration that she's taking us on. And you know, this takes us from offices of the presidents in Washington, D.C., Paris, and London, to views from the sky of how, you know, the space is seen from above. But also we have a moment where we look into the drones, how they work. And also then we go and see how the enemy itself sees the drones from below, and how for them this machinery works. And to be able to capture all of these different specificities, and also at the same time see law and in between them, the language that informs the way that we speak and stabilize these practices, this is done in such a wonderful way that it's impressive. And I think for me as a PhD researcher in law, what I so much for law doesn't have to be localized. It doesn't have to be a specific place we seek for answers, but that it is possible, and it's actually very productive to go and look into these complex relations. And even if we're not able to uncover assemblage, because Khalil and Gina have mentioned so many other actors that may have important to include, but of course due to limitations it's not possible perhaps to look everywhere, but to be able to capture at least a part of it is already such a wonderful achievement, and helps us to understand better what is happening. So I'll stop sharing my screen right now, but I'll continue from my notes. So on another point, I wanted to also touch upon how the law, but also how the technology features in this book and in this methodology, because what I find really surprising is that to a certain extent, this discussion of whether drones are new, revolutionary, actually still continues, right? And I found recently came across a paper titled "Why Drones Have Not Revolutionized War" from late 2022, in which the authors actually go on a very detailed analysis of comparing each conflict and how drones did or did not the military advantage. And what I find
Klaudia, is your connection?
Yes.
Is your connection okay?
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, now we can. Yes.
I'm very sorry about this.
No,
I hope you were able to grasp before what I was saying. Okay, I'll just continue then. So yeah, in that paper, when they compare the different conflicts and how drones are used there is missed in that type of analysis largely is the causal link that is drawn between A type of technology and B type of outcome. So there's kind of a tendency to think that, okay, there's a specific way that drones are used and there's a specific outcome that we can expect from it in all contexts. If we think again of the little drawing that I did and Rebecca's book, she shows that it's a combination of so many different factors that leads to this specific warfare characteristic. So it's also very much about the enemy that is here present, the anti-statist enemy challenges these interstate sovereignty powers, but is also so much about the specific bureaucratic assemblage that is here, the context of the. And I think this is very important because otherwise it may think that drones always lead to the same outcome. And in Ukraine, we also see that drones are used in very different ways than in these conflicts on transnational terrorist networks. And if we only look at technology as an actant that leads to a certain outcome without taking the broader context of it, I think we're missing, we may be missing the point. And I think also linking this now to the broader debates in autonomous weapon systems, there's a tendency also to look at how autonomous weapon systems will or will not be able to target individuals without really taking into consideration, again, the logics of the militaries that are performing these acts, the enemy that triggers certain ways of using technology, that the language that is used, the legislation that is or isn't embedded, the vagueness of it, all of it is so important. So this is something that I think really in literature requires more attention. And then
it's working.
Okay, then moving to my third and second to last point, looking at how law also features in this study, what I find very compelling is the way that Rebecca studies how law mutates, and not always in traditional ways. You know, there's of course a great deal of doctrinal analysis there as well, and we see how law through traditional means evolves, but also we see how other actors like the ICRC and others in more bureaucratic ways formulate these mutations. And this is something that I think in traditional doctrinal scholarship may also be overlooked, but I think it also leads us to a different type of consideration of how certain technologies and practices become within these legal ambiguities considered compliant, that otherwise, if we have maybe studied the technology from the very beginning, saying, you know, this is kind of the provision that we have, and this provision allows this or that, and then we study the compliance with the technology. This is in this book, it's completely reversed, right? And this leads to more nuanced and a greater understanding of what is or is not on the basis of these mutations. To my research in autonomous weapon systems, but also other AI technologies, because a lot of research in this field is also conducted in the way where conclusions are drawn because the law is interpreted by the researcher in a certain way, then the technology will or will not be compliant, and that misses the whole fabric of this assemblage that makes things permissible or not. So that's another takeaway. And last, to finish off with a quote as well, I was very much so interested in the way that you also see conclusions drawn in this book, because I think it challenges the doctrinal researchers that expect you know, what will we do with this and how will we act upon this? And I think your book shows, and your analysis of this shows, that it's at some point you say I have here the quote that unless one voluntarily engages in a deconstruction of new institutional apparatus, the drone bureaucratic machinery assembled through legal rationals and discourses, the type of enemy survives the turnover of the bureaucrats. I would have actually loved to see that at the conclusion to say to what extent, that intervention is possible by legal scholars. Is it something that we are or should be entitled to do? What is our space in this as well? And I think we do, of course, see how, for example, now with the conflict of Ukraine, these interventions maybe not voluntarily, but were made, and they also changed the way that drones in a certain machinery perform. But this is a very important point. And to that, you also asked the questions at the end, and you said, so I have tried to understand in the conclusion, you say, what drone programs produce, to which the answer is an extension of warfare and state power. This is the answer to the question, what? And so, of course, in the entire book, you do it very nuancedly, but you hear your answer that it's through technology and the law that this machinery is performed. And then you say, but the very important question, why? You don't say it's important, but you say that the question why is left perhaps unanswered in this book, and that first would be necessary. And I was pondering on that question as well. So to what extent can we answer the question? Is it necessary? Perhaps maybe more important for what? And that this question that you've been thinking about further and how you're thinking about it has evolved. So again, thank you so much for sharing. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your interventions. I think before we open the floor with questions, we can have each one of us react to what has been said. I don't know if Rebecca wants to start, and then we give the floor to the others. So yeah, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stefania, and thank you all. I feel really extremely spoiled to have been listening to your feedback, but also for your time and generosity in engaging with the book. You know, when you turn it into a book, then you think, well, probably my defense panel members will be the first and last ones to have read the book, and this is the evidence that it's not always the case. And I feel that, you know, when I really thought about this book launch, I was kind of hoping that the three of you would be also less humble in putting my book at the forefront, or rather than putting my book at the forefront, bring your own scholarly endeavors and works. I mean, the empirical study and the empirical part of it, and the interview of drone pilots, but also of victims of drone strikes. Khalil, you're going to pursue this work in much more powerful ways, and your work speaks to the stability of the drone program. So I'm sure we'll have more conversations about this, about the feminist and gendered perspective. Gina, you would have told this story in much more powerful ways than I have managed to do in the book. And Klaudia, you are embarking on a similar journey of accumulating traces of techno-legal machineries, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing your work flourish further as well. I want to quickly do justice to the generosity and the huge amount of work that you've put into this, and react to some things in your comments that I found all very inspiring, and maybe I will combine them together, because I think that your contributions really also echoed one another. On the individualized warfare and the idea that the individualization produces racialized and gendered individuals, or reinforces oppression, that Gina formulated, but also it was echoed later on by Khalil. I think you're absolutely right that somehow the story I tell leaves some things implicit, or at least with the idea, with the method of accumulating traces. I was hoping that without my labeling of the book or of this contribution in certain terms, the story would speak for itself somehow. But were I to read or to write actually the book again today, I would probably change the angle or start to tell the story differently. So it's very funny also to see how we evolve as authors. But your point really echoed my current work, where I'm very much interested in putting an emphasis on the fact that, contrary to the mainstream understanding of technology as being revolutionary, these techno-legal modes of governance do not solely bring change, but also very much fix and stabilize some features of the world or the worlds. And this is made mainly because they build on historical past data to predict the future, and they promise to do so with objectivity, truth, scientificity. And so by using past data to predict, for instance, dangerousness in the security realm in particular, these modes of governance, I fully concur, code, fix, often very racialized and gendered representations of normality, abnormality, and dangerousness. And this echoes, as Khalil pointed out, what can be observed in other domains. And to react to the other point about the combination of internal and external accounts of law, I think that this stabilization of historical modes of oppression is better accounted for by combining different approaches and accounts of the law. So I am really happy that this is something you picked up on, that I didn't decide to only have a social legal approach to this phenomenon, but I also was very much keen on adopting the internal point of view to identify which available options within each legal concept are mobilized by the diversity of actors to push for specific interpretations of a given norm and shape warfare in specific ways, shape societies, or this results in shaping societies and affecting people in violent ways. So indeed, the combination of methods for me is crucial to obtain this mode of storytelling. And this is maybe what I will end with, because I think your comments also very much converged on spaces for resistance. So the idea, of course, of technology and violence, but also technology, violence, and resistance that Gina formulated in the first place. But I think in many ways, Khalil's comments and Klaudia's also echoed this quest or this question. And I think that, to go back to my previous point on storytelling, the mode of storytelling, I think this is one way in which I felt I was contributing to this, or was hoping for it. So in a much less cynical manner than the tone of the book, the overall tone of the book reflects, I think there was the ambition with the book to tell a story and pay tribute to the multiplicity of experiences that are provoked by this techno-legal machinery, this oppressive techno-legal machinery, and create, by taking storytelling seriously, create a counter narrative to the dominant narrative. And in that sense, maybe as storytellers or as a storyteller, create somehow a space for healing. So it's generally not common to hear this in legal scholarly work, but by abandoning the quest for truth or the quest for the perfect scientific equation, I was hoping, by accumulating all these traces, to create somehow, or to pay tribute to the experiences that drone programs generate. But more concretely, maybe, to also open up for the discussion, I've been very interested since the completion of this project in techno-legal modes of resistance. And here I'm not opposing techno-legal modes of governance and resistance. They're not a paradox, they're not a tension, but part of the same story. So where there is governance, there is resistance, and vice versa. When there is counter-conduct or conduct, there is counter-conduct. When there is dominant narrative, there is counter-narrative. And so I've been very interested in also maybe raising the voice or making visible techno-legal modes of resistance, which all have in common that, similarly to techno-legal modes of governance, they make visible embodied experiences at the margins. And by making these lived experiences visible in a techno-legal way, they create evidence for courts and other legal institutions. And in that context, I mainly conceptualize resistance as counter-conduct or counter-narrative that rejects this fixing that, Gina, you were talking about, that rejects this essentializing of individuals and that cultivates thickness, density, and maybe also embrace the idea that we are all and should remain unreadable. Something that runs very counter to these techno-legal modes of governance in the security realm in particular. I would like to engage further, but I also am aware that we have participants in the room that may want to may want to jump in. But I just want to reiterate a huge thank you to Gina, Khalil, and Klaudia for their engagement.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your reaction. So I don't know if there are any reactions from the panel. Perhaps if you do, we can devote 2-3 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have reactions, feel free to take the floor.
I've got probably some quite scattered thoughts that I'm happy to add in. So I just wanted to pick up on this point about the internal and the external approach and the kind of commitment to legal excellence, particularly around doctrinal, but this kind of humanity that you bring through going external to that simultaneously, that's just so powerful. And I think that you kind of didn't own that enough, that there is a kind of commitment to a way of knowing, and maybe it comes out through the storytelling. And I love the phrase that you offered us at the beginning of this archive of the present. And I'd love to, think more with you about that in terms of continuities around colonialism. And I think Klaudia really brought to the fore how important your methods and methodologies are. And, we just look forward to you kind of naming and owning them and putting them up front in the future, especially what you're telling us about storytelling. And I guess the final thought was just wondering about environmental perspectives and technology and what place that they play. I think that when we're talking about techno-legal modes of resistance, we can't not be talking about environmental kind of effects and environmental perspectives as also offering potential spaces of resistance, thinking about critical Black studies and what they offer to the field through thinking through the lens of Earth, the landscape, air, extractive capital and its consequences for the environment, which is just, as I said, pretty random. I'm just kind of adding it in, and I'd love to see the thought lines that follow forward. Really looking forward to the next work. Thank you. And some questions from the audience.
Okay, so if we don't have any other reactions from the panel, then I invite questions from the audience. You can raise your virtual hand and then I'll give you the floor. Otherwise, since the event is recorded, if you are uncomfortable in taking the floor, feel free to send the questions in the chat, and then I will read it out loud for our speakers. So yeah, the floor is yours.
It's also lunch break, so it's fine if you are just tuning in and listening into the discussion.
Perhaps I can just also add to, like, in a very short also answer to or response to what you've also formulated. I find it also very interesting how these pursuits of or how technology often is framed actually as objective and scientific, and it provides the full answer to the complexity and the messiness of war. And I see that also in the way that algorithms are used. And I mean, it's interesting because often within these debates, algorithms are the ones that are framed to be scientific and objective without taking into consideration what has been happening before and kind of the context within which they emerge, where your work shows that these pursuits or these claims have already existed beforehand, right? So even before algorithms, when drones were used, and of course at some point when drones and algorithms become one, there's a kind of search for, or not maybe a search, but there's probably both a search for scientificity and objectivity, but there's also this this narrative that this is what these militaries are doing. It's almost like a mantra that whatever technology they get, it's more there. And at the same time, the more they use these technologies, the more it seems that this complexity and messiness is something that they cannot escape from. That even with more algorithms, even with seeing more object spaces and enemies and bodies, through these drone programs, but also later to be able to fill these in algorithmic ways, it still doesn't necessarily reduce for them that complexity. So this is something that that's why I think that this connecting work on drones with work on algorithms, which sadly is very rarely done, is actually really important.
Thank you. And I think Khalil, I think you also wanted,
just as a final remark, just going off the back of the panels of Rebecca's last comments, it's really interesting to also interject the price and the injuries of the global war on terror with these systems of violence. And we talk, and I think Gina was mentioning resistance. Within the former drone pilot space and the whistleblowers in the US, and that's how they identify themselves, there is this kind of persuasion that they have and the intent of resisting the violence from within. And it's interesting because they themselves, and I would like to mention a few things about them because I believe they also deserve credit. They themselves have go through immense personal violence from the state just for their resistance, and from a male perspective and a female perspective as well. So it's amazing because I speak to them on an everyday basis. Really, we're good friends in the US, and there's disruption in their life. There's disruption from a professional standpoint, from a legal structural standpoint. There's everyday injuries. And sometimes when it's their voices which comes to the platform, the global platforms to speak, behind the scenes, there's a lot of violence that's not really seen. And I think that's it's an unseen part of the debate, but it very much well does exist. And they do reach out to individuals to provide information for context, who they kind of align with. Second of all, which was partially mentioned, which is the lived experiences on the ground. Sometimes as academics, practitioners, we tend to use language and vernacular, which is still violent as well. So whilst, and this is particularly a critique to legal academics, whilst we try to do good things and we try to criticize violent structures, we also perpetuate the violence from a political and social way, otherizing the other, for instance, even if we, we reference all the post-colonial scholars, but still within our narrative, we are still perpetuating the violence, which is also seen within the structures of the drone programs, whether it's in the US or the UK or in other places. So just to note that. And we have seen, which I wanted to mention in the beginning, there have been government lawyers, in fact, who have been trying to push a normalization of the individualization of warfare, which Rebecca cogently puts forward. For example, Harold Cole. Now, Harold Cole is an individual, as a government lawyer, who also tried to normalize many practices within Guantanamo Bay. And if we go back 20 years, we also see, under the context of the global war on terror, a contestation spearheaded by the US on really formulating new jurisprudence, i.e. we are not giving POW status to X, Y, and Z, we do not consider them a combatant, etc. And that's really interesting because depending on how we want to approach the conversation, even if it was just a law, like a law of armed conflict conversation, it has implications from an asymmetric lens, asymmetric warfare lens, especially when we bring in non-international armed conflict, the way they, i.e. those who are otherwise govern themselves. It becomes a very interesting norm contestation. It's also research that I did maybe 6 years ago on how non-state armed groups perceived the US drone warfare in several places. And they have jurisprudence as well. It's really interesting to see how they react to asymmetric warfare. It's some work that I did with NATO, but also through NGOs as well. And lastly, it's the lived experiences, which the book also goes into quite in depth. So we have funerals. There's in the book, it's noted a bit incorrectly from my cultural understanding, but the reason why funerals do not necessarily take place is because of double tap strikes. So there have been numerous amounts of incidences, whether it's Pakistan, Somalia, or even Yemen, where groups and crowds have been targeted because of a funeral, and they justify it on the basis of, oh, one individual was a known fighter, so we had to target them, even though it's a funeral. And in my opinion, it's outside of the of a conflict of war, even though that might not necessarily apply within the the jurists of war of drone programs. And if we look to Yemen, I have interviewed people who have been struck in the wedding. Similarly, in Mali, a contested strike in Bounty. I spoke to individuals that have video recordings of individuals, and they are civilians on the ground. And the contestation, or should I say, the obstruction of the violence in the knowledge space because of the vernacular and violence of the global war on terror, its tentacles has influenced actors which you would not really have perceived to have influence. I don't want to name them, but there are organizations which have high value standing within international law scholarly spaces who prevent the knowledge production of bot strikes, and they also bring to the platform their legal advisors as a mean of pernicious ignorance, of not really providing evidence on a particular strike, even though they admit that they treated, for instance, civilians. So it's a very interesting discussion, and I really look forward to taking it forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. We have a question in the chat. I'm going to read it out. The question is from Dimitri. So he says, your work is so inspiring. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about what a form of tech activism that insists on opacity and readability could look like. Are you thinking about this in terms of system designs, technique, or visual distortion? I'd love to hear more if you have any thoughts already on that. So Rebecca, I'll let you react to our panelists' reactions and then this question, and the floor is yours again.
Thank you so much, and thank you also to Khalil and Klaudia as well, Gina, for adding some really important thoughts to the mix. I mean, the environmental question. I think we had a friend in the room, Marie Petersman, who joined earlier and who has a fantastic project around this and more than human universes, and thinking of also about modes of contestations or resistance in this framework and context. But also thanks for mentioning critical Black studies that are really important to think about the issues that we are touching upon now. Responding to Dimitri's question in the chat, thanks so much, Dimi. I think this is a really I mean, it's a key question, and that one that keeps me thinking on a daily basis now for a while. And I think it's mainly for me it's very interesting to think about it from the starting point of the structural inequality in the access to knowledge or vision or signals. So vision broadly understood as knowledge in a world where images are taken as direct manifestations of truth. And if we think of drone programs, I think it's really useful to see that there is such a structural inequality in the access to vision. And in this context, the techno-legal modes of resistance that I'm interested in try to destabilize in different ways. So you rightly mentioned indeed visual distortion. It could be camouflage, but it could also be by recomposing scenes and situations of violence. Of course, forensic architecture's work is quite powerful in that sense. But all these modes of techno-legal resistance that I'm interested in are all aiming at destabilizing this structural inequality in the access to signals, knowledge, vision, in whatever way you want to put it. But of course, I would love to continue the discussion on this with you. I see that there are not many more comments in the chat, but very nice messages from colleagues. So thank you so much for being here. And again, huge thanks to Stefania, to you for chairing this event, to my colleagues from the ESIL Interest Group, and to Klaudia, Khalil, and Gina for your very, very generous engagement with the book. I cannot thank you enough. So yeah, I will leave it at this.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks to all our speakers for joining us for this very interesting discussion. I hope this debate gave you some inspiration to go and read the book if you haven't done so yet. I also wanted to share that if you want, there is currently a 20% discount code for the book, which I'm putting in the chat. So this is all for you. And then thanks again for joining. The ESIL Interest Group is also organizing a pre-conference workshop in Aix-en-Provence. So we will be sharing the program of the workshop very soon, and we hope to see you there either in person or virtually. And thanks so much, and we look forward to engaging more with work in this kind of space. Thank you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.